Later, the lord of the area too also became a practitioner and believer of Nichiren Shonin. He gave a statue of the Buddha standing up to Nichiren Shonin. This statue of Buddha Shakyamuni, Nichiren Shonin kept with him for his entire life. So you can imagine that these episodes of this first great exile that he had to encounter were something that left a very strong, very great impression on Nichiren. After 2 years in exile, Nichiren Shonin was pardoned, and he again returned to Kamakura to continue the spreading of faith and practice of the Lotus Sutra. Like I mentioned before, going on exile was not a holiday, nor did it mean he went into retirement and just waited for his time in exile to be up. Nichiren Shonin did not at all remain inactive, not in the least. He wrote many important writings which have become some very fundamental basics of Nichiren Buddhism and doctrine, such as the Shion Sho, or the 4 debts of gratitude to one's parents, to all living beings, to one's sovereign, and to the 3 treasures of Buddhism. He also wrote the Kyoki-ji Kokusho, the propagation of the Dharma in accordance with the teaching capacity, situation of the people, the times, and the country in which one resides. And the Ken Hobo Sho, an examination of slander against the Dharma. I'd like to talk just a little bit about these writings Nichiren wrote during his exile in Izu. Some of them he wrote as a sort of continuation of his spirit, of the spirit of the Rissho Ankoku Ron. Others are a bit of contrast or complementary to the other teachings. It's very interesting, though, to point out that as was during the case of his exile to Izu, when he was experiencing some of the most difficult times of his life, as it also happened during his exile to Sado Island after the near execution at Tatsunokochi, Nichiren Shonin wrote some of the most important of his writings, writings which have become the basis of Nichiren Buddhism and all of his, the foundation of the doctrine of his teachings. For example, we talked earlier about the 4 debts of gratitude, which I would like to go into a little bit more detail in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to talk about one other writing which seems to be in a bit of contrast to the Rissho Ankoku Ron, or to what some people might think of who Nichiren Shonin really is. And that is the Kyoki-ji Kokusho, the propagating of the Dharma in accordance with the teaching capacity, situation of the people, the times, and the country in which one resides. Now, Nichiren Shonin talked about in this writing that we have to choose the times, the conditions of the people. We have to, when we propagate the Dharma, we have to propagate it according to the capacity of the people, according to their culture, according to their society, the land in which they live, their customs, the times in which we live, etc. So, since Nichiren Shonin lived in very particular times in medieval Japan, which was a very difficult time to live in, just as it was here in Europe, Nichiren Shonin had to face certain difficulties and certain situations that today in the modern era he wouldn't have to face. There are laws and things to protect people, whereas in the Middle Ages there weren't. Society was structured and developed into a certain way today, in which in the Middle Ages it wasn't that way. Life was much more difficult. And so Nichiren Shonin was also faced with some Buddhist temples that were very much an extension of the Kamakura government. And he saw this corruption between the state and religion, together with a degrade in Buddhist practice in his eyes. as something that had to be addressed. He was very critical of many of the schools of that time, as were many other Buddhist priests of that area. For example, Dogen, was a great Zen priest, was also highly critical of many of the schools of Buddhism of that time. So Nichiren was not alone in these. Most of these Buddhist priests taught in a similar way, and sometimes were very critical of other Buddhist movements. In this respect, Nichiren was not alone. However, as I said earlier, Nichiren had to take the government to call, had to call them on their way of governing the land because of this great suffering he saw in the society, and also the confusion of the world of Buddhism of his time. We have to underline this point. He made this great criticism and took this stance based on the conditions of that time period.